And greetings once more to the great class of 2024. I apologize for the delays there as we dealt with what I'm told was a network outage. But we're back with you now, thank goodness, and I'm very glad to be with you again and looking forward to an engaging conversation over the course of the next hour. Intellectual conversations like the one we're about to have lie at the heart of this great university. For your first Princeton assignment, I asked you to read Jill Lepore's important and ambitious book, This America, The Case for the Nation. As I wrote in the foreword to the pre-read edition of the book, I chose This America in part because it addresses some of the most important ethical issues of our time, including how Americans and the people of other nations can feel united in a shared quest for the common good, despite differences and disagreements that might pull them apart. I look forward to meeting with you over the course of this academic year to discuss the book and what it means for each of our lives. Today, we have the wonderful opportunity to kick off the semester by engaging in a discussion with Dr. Jill Lepore herself. Dr. Lepore and I want this event to be as interactive as possible, so we're going to begin with a brief conversation and then open things up for your questions. Before I introduce Dr. Lepore, I'd like to invite our Deputy Vice President for Communications and moderator for today's event, Ben Chang, back to the virtual stage for a quick rundown of the format.
Thanks very much, President Eisgruber. And let me add my welcome to all of you and your families to the Princeton community. Welcome to the great class of 2024. The format today will be as follows. After opening the conversation between President Eisgruber and Professor Lepore, we will open the floor to your questions. Please note the questions are reserved for the members of the great class of 2024. Raise your hand in the Zoom function and I will recognize you, and then activate your camera if you choose and unmute. A reminder that this event is being recorded, so if you raise your hand, your question will be a part of the recorded event, saved for those classmates and others to view who are unable to join at this time. So with that overview, back to you, President Eisgruber.
Great, thank you, Ben. It's now my pleasure to introduce our special guest today. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper Class of 41 Professor of American History and Affiliate Professor of Law at Harvard University, a staff writer at The New Yorker, and the host of the podcast, The Last Archive. A prolific author of books and essays, she has received numerous honors and awards for her work, and she has been a finalist for the National Book Award, the National Magazine Award, and the Pulitzer Prize twice. In recent months, she has written a series of insightful essays for The New Yorker on issues ranging from the history of loneliness to the 50th anniversary of the Kent State shootings to the invention of American policing. And I'm going to ad lib from my remarks for just a moment here because she was also featured in today's New York Times book review with an interview with the author in connection, I think, with the promotion of her forthcoming book due out on September 15th called If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future. We're so pleased that she is here with us. Jill Lepore, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much, and hello to all of you students. I wish I was there. I wish we were all there in New Jersey together, but it's an honor to be with you in this virtual way as well.
So Jill, it's great to see you and have you here in our Zoom assembly. I'd like to begin with a couple of questions about you and your book just to get things started. And let me start with one that's a bit biographical. We're here right now with hundreds of Princeton students who are just embarking on their college experience. And so I want to invite you to think back to your own college experience and your own first day of college and tell us who you were at that point. Were you thinking you were going to become a great American historian?
No, I was wondering whether I would end up finishing college. I was not really clear I wanted to go to college, actually. I had applied to one school, and I went to Tufts, and I remember this time of the year, I didn't go first to Tufts because the only way I could go to college was on a scholarship, and I had an Air Force ROTC scholarship. So my parents drove me not to Tufts, but to MIT, which is where the Air Force ROTC detachment was, and I had, I think, 2 weeks of boot camp before the semester started. So the drop off was there, and yeah, so I went there, and then I think I just took the T over to Tufts when I needed to move from MIT into my freshman dorm. Also a week early because I was doing varsity field hockey. So and I was a math major. Yeah, so nothing that would have augured becoming an American historian. I was just kind of putting one foot in front of the other, trying to make ends meet. My big concern was how to pay for it all, which is a big concern of so many students now. I think facing much more dire challenges. But no, I was nowhere near. I didn't study in history in college, honestly. So I didn't have the laser-like focus that many of my own students appear to have, and which I'm sort of envious of, but I'm sometimes somewhat suspicious of. I think if you don't know what you're doing, the big secret is that neither does anyone else. So there's just some people who are better at faking it.
I think that's a good piece of wisdom as we start the school year. I think most of us find there are a lot of unexpected turns in the paths that we take after we reach college. So let me turn our attention now to the book. I chose This America for the pre-read months ago and talk about unexpected turns in the path. It feels now like we're in a completely different world, given the crises that our country is facing, from the global pandemic to a national reckoning with the scourge of racism throughout our society. You write about slavery and its terrible legacy, among other things, in This America. Do you think differently about your book in light of current events?
I guess yes and no. I wrote the book very much of a moment out of grave concern about the nature of our attachment to the idea of a liberal nation. It's the case, it's sort of a commonplace to say that the United States is really an idea. Like what we hold in common is a set of commitments to equality and justice and liberty and to the consent of the governed. And if we don't hold those ideas together, then very little ties us to one another. And that had become very apparent as a kind of ongoing crisis, something that I'd been paying attention to as a historian. And I was asked to write this book. I was asked to write some kind of an accounting of the relationship between nationalism and liberalism. So, it's kind of came out of that moment. And I do think we're very much still in that moment, right? What holds the nation together, what holds us together as a people is, I think, less and less clear to many people. Where the kind of the polarization that the nation is suffering through is worsening day by day. There's also great reason for hope and for optimism. So much of that argument is so essential. So much of the confrontation, the moral confrontation with the nation's past, the political confrontation with injustice and racial injustice, these things are so vital and essential, and Overdue doesn't really begin to cover that. Would I have written it differently? Yes, because I'm sort of writing all the time, and I hope that all of you listening, you have lively minds. Like that's what is bringing you to Princeton, to do what you want to do here. You should be changing your mind a lot about a lot of things, and if you don't find yourself changing your mind over the coming weeks and months, then something's not working right. So yeah, I would have taken a different approach to maybe some of the things that I stressed here. But that's all to the good.
Wonderful. Before we find out what is on our students' minds right now, because we're going to turn to them for questions right after this, I just want to ask you whether there's anything else you might want to touch on before we hand things over to the students to start asking questions.
Yeah, I think for me, this is a complicated moment to be a historian, because historians are often asked, is this unprecedented? And we're generally asked that by political partisans who want to enlist historians in their partisan battles. And so for the first few decades of my career as a historian, I would always be asked that question. And I knew it was a loaded question, like, well, no, you're supposed to say this is unprecedented so that you can condemn whoever has done the thing. And for years, I was very suspicious of that question, because most things are precedented, honestly. It's a very disorienting moment as a historian that we are living through a moment without precedent. And I have thought a lot about, I have 3 kids of my own, 2 of whom are college students. Like, I have thought a lot about what it means to come of age in an unprecedented time, where what your elders can tell you is of limited use. We're the ones who screwed everything up. So like, well, I think it's a very challenging moment to be a young person. But the what I think about when I think about, I'm meeting my own students for the first time on Wednesday of this week. We have our first class. What it is to be doing this. This is your college. This is your first year of college. You alone have had this experience. No one else has had this experience. What does this mean? What does this do? What are its consequences? That's for you to tell us. So it's a very weird moment to be a historian in that, like, I'm the student of the history that you all are experiencing.
Right. Well, as I said to the students today when I delivered my opening remarks, there's no playbook for what they're about to go through and what they're about to do. And it's sobering to hear you as a historian say something like that as well. I'm going to hand things back to Ben Chang at this point so that we can start hearing from some of those student voices directly. Jill, thank you again, and I look forward to the conversation.
This is great. What a fantastic start to the event. And thanks to the members of the class of 2024 who are eagerly raising their hands. I was wondering who would be the intrepid first questioner, bravely stepping into the breach. And happy to say that it is Valeria from the great town of Gainesville, Florida, who has our first question for you, Professor Lepore.
Good afternoon, Professor Lepore. I'm honored to meet you, and I'm honored to be part of this great class of 2024. I have a question about this seeming cycle that you kind of like delineate in your book. When you're arguing against this more like radical, in a sense, nationalism that has pervaded our country many times, it seems like it's almost in some sort of cycle. And this cycle between the nationalism you argue against and the liberal nationalism that you promote has been happening many times over in American history. So do you think that this cycle will just continue over and over? I know that there are many people in the nation that support the nationalism you argue against, and is there a politically correct way to root out this idea of the nationalism you argue against, even when those nationalists are the majority?
Yeah, thanks. That's such a perceptive question. Pattern detection is so much of the work of any kind of, intellectual inquiry. So I'm fascinated that you think of that as a pattern in that way. And I think there probably is something to that. I think that, I talk about ethnic nationalism and liberal nationalism, say the sort of a race-based or ethnicity-based nationalism that is historically associated really with atrocity and with aggression, versus a liberal nationalism whose priority is the guarantee of constitutional rights to the citizens of a nation state. And I think those two things have been in, through lines all across American history. So which one is wielding power has does, I guess, maybe seesaw, maybe more than cycle would be maybe a way I might visualize it. And what has been the case in my lifetime is that I think that the defense of liberal nationalism has become extremely weak. And in the absence of that defense, the kind of, I don't think that a race-based nationalism has been strengthened, honestly, so much as it hasn't been sufficiently argued against. And one reason for that is, as I argue in the book, is that, after the Second World War, intellectuals, looked at what ethnic nationalism had done around the world and said, we can't we can't defend the nation state at all. We'll just have to kind of hope that we enter a new stage, a kind of post-nationalist world, a global world. And they kind of embraced globalism instead and thought that kind of liberal ideas could be expressed. And then you just kind of get, what you get out of it is neoliberalism. So it seemed important to me, and the reason I wrote the book was to say, well, what if you take seriously what the tradition of liberal nationalism, try to hold on to it and try to bring it forward. I think it's a tricky argument to make, and it's why people don't make it, because it seems so easily to slip into something else. But I was very persuaded by writers whose work I had read, who had suggested that real advances in political equality had only ever been possible in the United States by making a liberal nationalist argument. That's an element that is necessary to achieve that kind of progress. So I wanted to try to rekindle that tradition.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lepore, for your answer, and thank you so much, President Eisgruber, for your thought-provoking pre-read selection.
Thanks, Valeria. Our next question goes to, and I hope I get the pronunciation correct, Tejas from just down the way in Short Hills, New Jersey. Looking locally, thinking globally. Over to you.
Hello. I'm just getting a hang of this panelist version of Zoom that I've never been in. But hi, I'm Tejas. And my question is, so this past year, I lived in India through the Novogratz Bridge Year program. And I noted that one of the most important takeaways is that we're very united inside, like all people are very united across nations based on the most important priorities, such as education for children and basic needs for food and water. And especially inside a pandemic, which has created such global strife, what do you think our role is as global citizens? And how do you think that nations should reconcile that goal between each other?
I mean, I think that the tradition on which we should be drawing, or the twin tradition of human rights and global health, which are extraordinary realms of international cooperation and the elevating of standards for the mutual benefit. I mean, I guess I would add to that, the third leg of that stool would be environmentalism as a global movement. I don't think that has happened. It doesn't seem to me that the global response to the pandemic has followed any of those models. It is the human rights model, the global health model, or the environmental model. Really, what we're looking at is kind of capitalist competition for a vaccine. We're looking at a lot of hyper nationalism, a kind of, the America firstism, the version of that in other nations, the walling off of borders. I mean, one of the things that, a virus crosses national borders, and one way that you fight a virus is by shutting down borders, right? So, even if you leave New Jersey, depending on what state you're going to go into, you might be pulled over by on the side of the road and asked if you have a COVID test with you, right? Like even state by state, county by county, there are kind of border impositions, right? It's a way, there's a nativism and a hostility to immigration in that at the national level, but there's also a real public health reason to care about borders. So I don't know, I find the national competition for the vaccine, like who gets the vaccine first and can protect their people best, to be unbelievably disheartening. Like we are not even having, say, even within the United States or even in the state where I live, we are not currently having a conversation about if there is, a vaccine, a certain amount, like who would be, wouldn't we of course want to give it to frontline workers and public school teachers before anybody else? Like, shouldn't we be setting those protocols up? What are the conversations that we might have both internally and across national borders, and certainly within the United States across state borders, about meaningful commitments to the vulnerable? And how would we do that beyond the nation? I think instead of thinking expansively in that way, there's been a kind of great inwardness, right? I think if I were writing an essay about this moment, it would probably be called The Great Inwardness. Like we are being driven so much into these little kind of caves, both within our homes. I mean, I'm looking around in my own environment, you know, but these connections are so essential, but they're harder and harder to sustain over the long term. So all which is to say, it's a great question. I think there's much that we should be doing, and I think there's very little that we currently are doing, that the forces of expansiveness and outwardness and what would be called cosmopolitanism, say, or forces of a kind of global-minded public health orientation are not the ones that are prevailing right now.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks very much for your question. Just a quick reminder, please raise your hand via the Zoom function so that we can add you to the queue for the questions. I will continue to do my best on names, so please forgive ahead of time. I will say we have a healthy set of questions from all over the US and around the globe already. So Professor Lepore will bring on Rohit from Singapore with our next question. Let's see, maybe we have a little bit of a hiccup. Rohit from Singapore, oh, here he is, fantastic. Over to you, sir.
Hello, Professor Lepore. So I wanted to ask a little bit about federalism, in the sense that I think it's one aspect of the American political system that is not as common or hasn't been replicated as much in constitutions around the world. And as you highlight in the book, of course, federalism initially was a very nationalist aspect of the United States. And in some ways it succeeded to an unprecedented quality to the federalist system these days is, in modern political discourse, might be anti-nationalist in that sense. But we've also seen through the COVID crisis that federalism in the United States has been providing more of a roadblock than as a success in that sense. So I was wondering what you thought about this aspect, and also in the sense of the international community. We've seen how quickly in a federalist system that power moves towards the top, and is that in any globalist society would be relying on some element of federalism, and does that experience lead us to a more nation-focused global society? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's a really complicated one as well. I'd be curious to hear what your view is on that. It sounds like I'm guessing you have a view on this important question. Do you want to share that before I launch in?
Well, what I was thinking about a little bit is the United States experience has shown that at least over 300 years, what might be designed as a federalist system moves towards a complete nationalist system. And if we were to have, in the ultimate globalist model, right, a united Earth of some kind, that we would see a similar dynamic. So that might be a good argument for focusing on nation states rather than continuing to pursue some sort of hyper-globalist society.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Well, I think what you see in the U.S. is that certainly, as you say, the vision of the framers of the Constitution, which they presented as a federalist vision, was fundamentally a nationalist vision. And to the degree that we don't have a nationalist form of government, that is to say, one in which the federal government has supremacy in all things, it is because of the defiance of the states and their insistence on their sovereignty, even through the ratification process by insisting on the Bill of Rights, right, and the enumeration of federal powers. And that balance has been very important in the United States. I think you could argue that it has been essential to the stability of the Union. But we could also say, certainly, that it extended the institution of slavery decades beyond which it maybe could have been dismantled. You could make a counterfactual argument there, right? That the Union wasn't worth preserving. Like if the cost of the Union was slavery, then we shouldn't have had it. Like that's an argument that you could make. That to defy what Americans understood to be right for the sake of the Union did in fact end up destroying the Union during the Civil War. So it's a complicated story in American history. nevertheless, the story of the 20th century largely is about the aggregation of power by the federal government, right? The rising power of the state. And that begins, with Woodrow Wilson, Princetonian Woodrow, controversial Princetonian Woodrow Wilson. Just the gathering of power to the office of, to the federal government in general, but also the rise of bureaucracy, the agencies that are founded, what on the far right is called the deep state now, but the rising power of the federal government through the progressive era and the New Deal did diminish in many ways the power of state governments. But since, this is just a little history primer, but for those of you who didn't take AP US history in the last 6 months, which is some set of you, since the era of Reagan, that the federal government has been largely divesting itself of a lot of that power, or seeming to, because it's been enhancing its power militarily, and in many forms of federal spending have risen in those years. So what we're seeing now during the pandemic has been quite interesting, which has really been led by the response to the pandemic has led by the states. Red states or blue states, but they have used their sovereign power to either defy or promote public health mandates, and in fact have forged new alliances. So the last one I heard of was when Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland, had formed a 7-state coalition. We am in New England, where we have a coalition that's around movement between the New England states. I think maybe New Jersey is now in this, like you can drive from New Jersey to Vermont without being in violation of a state law. But there's been a kind of new sectionalism. I think we could even call it that. People often think about, you probably learned in your US history class in high school, Frederick Jackson Turner's famous, now infamous, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. I think I even write about This America. He later wrote an essay called The Significance of the Section in American History. That is to say, the endurance of sectionalism as opposition to the power of the federal government. I think in the absence of strong federal action on behalf of the pandemic, we have seen a rising power in the states. What that means for international cooperation is complicated. I mean, to some degree, Wilson, of course, wanted the United States to join the League of Nations, which was partly of his making. And it is that resistance to what would become a multinational, that there would be a higher authority than your own national government, that led Americans, to defy that, the Senate to fail to endorse it, and the limited participation or the limited endorsement of the United Nations. So are we on the edge of some new cooperative global body? No. In fact, in the United States, we're just withdrawing all the time, withdrawing from this, that, and the other thing, from the Paris Climate Accords to the WHO.
Thanks very much, Farhi, and also for bearing with the time zone change. Our next question, Professor Lepore, comes from Gabe from Buffalo. Gabe, over to you.
Hello, Dr. Lepore. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to President Eisgruber as well. My question to you is more about the medium than the content. I've so much enjoyed reading your book, and I listened to your podcast this summer, and reading your articles in the New Yorker. And I was wondering, as a person who wants to be a writer in my career and wants to work in all three of those mediums, or media rather, which have you enjoyed the most writing it, and what ideas do you think come across the best in each of those mediums in particular? Because I know each works best to disseminate different ideas, but I wonder if you've thought about how you can use each to work with those different types of ideas.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think of all of the ways in which I do work as a writer as versions of how I teach, honestly. Like what I mainly do, like most of your faculty mainly, like we mainly are teaching, like this is what we do all day. Like not, think about how to take something that you really care about and know a lot about and help people sort of spark a spirit of inquiry about it by sharing your knowledge, but also instilling a hunger for more knowledge or for the discipline of that way of knowing and exploring. So, whether it's writing something for the New Yorker or writing a book or working on the podcast or I don't know, whatever else I might do, they all feel to me like versions of the same thing. Like something I'm so completely fascinated by, but it's just not inherently interesting. Like I remember I once had an assignment for the New Yorker, which was to write a history of taxation. And I just was like, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. Like even I am not interested in the history of taxation. Yet there are people whose whole lives is a study of the history of taxation. I just thought, how am I gonna make this interesting to begin with? And then how can I keep somebody interested when like I can barely, stir and the New Yorker has this thing called the strap hanger test. Have you ever heard of this? So the strap hanger test is, remember when you used to ride the subway? So the strap hanger test is like, you're supposed to, someone's reading your article on the subway and they're holding on to the strap while the subway's kind of chugging along. And they're reading your article, They get to the bottom of the page and the last word. In order to turn the page, they would have to let go of the strap and risk getting knocked into someone else on the train. I'm so nostalgic for this, I can't even say. So you have to be willing to let go of the strap to turn the page. As you're writing, this is just a piece of writing advice that I'm telling you this story because you asked about writing. As you're writing, you should be imagining the gap between every word should pass the strap hanger test. Like your reader should be motivated enough to find out what your next word will be, to risk getting knocked down on the subway. So I think about that a lot because I think about that when I teach, right? Like teaching is like, it's such a drag if people aren't following you and they're not, like you're paying a lot, your family's giving up a lot for you to be here. Like I should be holding your attention. So whether it's thinking about how a podcast works narratively or how you embed an argument in a story for an essay or what it is about the shape of a book that justifies it being a book rather than an essay, that strap hanger test is actually kind of in my mind. Because to pass that test, you have to be willing to let go of this strap. Like you have to be so into what you're thinking about. Like further to the crazy taxation essay, I ended up finding out that there was something about the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 that arguably led to the creation of the Federal Reserve. And an earthquake is a good story. Everybody likes an earthquake story. So like the piece opens with the earthquake and like all the money and all the banks is destroyed. And oh shoot, if we'd had a Federal Reserve, we could have got through, the earthquake without a financial panic. And it creates enough momentum for the federalizing of the monetary system, which is, necessary for what becomes the passage of the 16th Amendment, which makes graduated federal income tax constitutional. So I don't know. And when in doubt, start with an earthquake is my answer to your question.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. And thank you to the panelists as well. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Apologies for the delay. I'm taking some notes as a communicator, Professor Lepore, that strap hanger test does too. So I'm jotting that down.
Yeah.
Our next question is going to go to Malika from Rockville.
Hi, Professor Lepore. Thank you for joining us. So I have a question specifically about something you talk about towards the end of This America, which is you bring up journalist Jose Antonio Vargas's idea of collecting all these definitions of what it means to be American from all these immigrants. And you argue that America should be that collection of definitions, or rather like any nation in general is a collection of those kinds of definitions. And I think that's a really great idea. And, always in language, like the meanings of words simply depend on how people use them. And those words' meanings can change based on that. But there's still a lot of people who aren't ready to accept many different definitions of Americanness. And of course, you explained the importance of historical narratives to support that, but I'm sure you know I am, and many of the great class of 2024 are not renowned historians. So I'm wondering how you think individuals can reckon with defining their own identity, which they call the same as someone else, but it's a very different definition, and what concretely you think as citizens and specifically as university students we can do to promote the acceptance of all those different definitions.
Yeah, can you give me an example of like definitions that some people would believe to be inconsistent with each other?
I mean, as simple as, you know, birthright citizenship. And people would argue that, like, if your parents came here illegally and you're born here, you're not American. And it spans very widely. Like, I think some people would argue, you know, like I have birthright citizenship, but my parents have also been here for decades. And some people would argue my parents are Americans because they're immigrants and naturalized, but some people would also say they aren't. And that, like, I feel like can be a threat to their personal sense of identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is my question wasn't disagreeing with the, you know, the proposition of your question, but just getting some clarification there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really vexing issue because as a historian, I gotta say, it just seems so clear empirically that immigration to the United States is essential to what the United States is and ever could be, and that the incredible tapestry of that story historically just seems so overwhelming. But there is the counter story, which is the persistence of nativism and xenophobia, and of immigration restriction. I think xenophobia, you know, that just the underside of that narrative of, you know, the kind of immigrant story of America. What's also perplexing about it is that people who have done empirical research, like it seems like our contemporary political discussion of immigration is hyperpolarized. Like there are people, like, you know, certain people say, well, the Democrats want to just open the borders, and, you know, the Democrats will say, but the Republicans want to build a wall. And in some ways those things are both true, but in other ways, like most people don't want to either build a wall or have no borders, right? Like there's a really interesting research organization called More in Common. And what they do is empirical research where they do public opinion measurement, but they mess around with the questions so that the questions don't read as partisan questions. Like if you ask people, do you want to build a wall? People think, oh, I'm being asked an identity question. That is to say, did I vote for Trump? So I'm going to say yes, because I did vote for Trump, and I'm just being asked to say that, right? Or no, I didn't vote for Trump, so therefore I'm going to say no to that question. They're not actually, no one asked that question is really thinking about, like, should the federal government be allocating these funds to do this thing that requires this? But if you ask people, or if you ask people, should we have border restriction? But if you ask people questions that are not coded as partisan questions, most Americans actually agree. Like immigration is really vital and important and a source of ongoing dynamism. But maybe there should maybe be some enforcement of at the nation's borders. Like there is actually this very broad, I think the More in Common people call it the exhausted majority, which is like the overwhelming majority of people in the United States who are like, yeah, I don't know, immigration seems like a good idea, but on the other hand, like, I don't know, like maybe there should just be some more coherent laws around, like that. It's become like so much of our political discourse is absolutist, and it's because people are making so much money off of selling political messages to people. It's a frustrating thing, because for me, the history, certainly does not go all in one side, but the history really is about people who have fought again and again and again against immigration restriction have been on the right side of history, because they have they have opened doors and, you know, built staircases. And that's what we should be doing for one another.
Thank you, Professor Lepore.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right, our next question comes from Abid from Bangladesh via New York City.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So my question was, a lot of colleges and college campuses are generally characterized as kind of a liberal, at least left-leaning place. And it's not necessarily due to the fault of the classes, although often the professors are liberal. So my question was basically, do you think Princeton and other colleges promote liberal nationalism and not necessarily liberalism or conservatism?
I can't speak to Princeton per se.
Yeah, whatever you can, yeah.
I don't think, I mean, universities are worldly places. They have a very, by definition, outward-looking vantage. They want to bring people from all over the world to their beautiful campuses, and they want to send those people back out all over the world. So with the exception of, say, the service academies, which have a very specific interest in the nation state as an entity, I don't think there's, you know, a vision for that one way or the other on most campuses. Although I do think that
I guess I didn't necessarily mean are your classes or your professors giving you that sense, because it's so different for every student what classes they take. Me as an engineering student, I necessarily don't have to take those classes, and so I'm not even going to have to engage with a lot of that. But I mean, I guess just for the student body, because student bodies on colleges are often characterized as at least very left-leaning. So on the case of liberal nationalism versus nationalism, do you think they lean one way on the most of the time?
I think it varies. There are a lot of different kinds of institutions of higher education in the United States, if we're just talking about the US, right? There are evangelical Christian colleges, there are Catholic colleges, there's the service academies, there's HBCUs, there are community colleges. I think we do a disservice to the range of institutions when by college we mean like the Ivy League or something, or like Ivy Plus. And I don't mean to intimate that that's exactly where we're going, but I kind of hear like when people want to say, you know, the colleges are like left-leaning indoctrination, they generally are talking about a certain kind of like,
I see.
Broadly Ivy something.
Can we restrict the colleges to that then?
Yeah, it is the case that those institutions tend to have, they're politically liberal. Like they generally are politically liberal. There's some that are famously less so, that are more, you know, Stanford is a host to a number of research institutions and other institutions and think tanks that are conservative, was founded as, you know, in many ways to advance a set of conservative ideas. That hasn't always been the case. For instance, after the Second World War, the CIA funded a lot of area studies programs. And there's an enormous amount of defense funding that goes into the modern research university that's really, well, for the sake of the Cold War. So there's an enormous amount of federal government defense money and federal government money of other sorts that goes into university. Like I think there's a different story of higher education in the middle decades of the 20th century. This moment that we're in now, where people want to say, you know, higher education is a bunch of, you know, liberals or whatever, is a kind of post-Vietnam moment where, and that is largely about the incredible energy that students who are engaged in the civil rights movement and then in the free speech movement and the anti-war movement are bringing, you know, are engaged in activism on college campuses, where young people are the leaders of, I mean, starting in 1960, you know, in Greensboro, North Carolina, which really kind of begins a decade of student protest, that the protests that have been going, you know, like imagine this past spring and summer with the George Floyd protests, if classes had been in schedule, what would had been on campuses, like what kind of student movements there would have been on college campuses versus, you know, what became, you much more of a kind of like urban street sort of situation. In the 60s, a lot of that action was on campuses. So much of how we think about higher education kind of dates from that era, and dates in particular to also faculty-led disavowal of accepting money from the government for defense spending at research universities. There are all kinds of ethics laws that emerged in the wake of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, I mean, that fits into like being liberal or left-wing, but do you think that necessarily fits into your idea of what liberal nationalism is versus nationalism?
No, because I think one of the arguments is that most liberals don't want to talk about nationalism or think about the nation state, right? Because that's been an important piece of intellectual work, of kind of disavowal, right? So I don't think that schema fits on there.
Okay, so students are not engaging in either way of the spectrum, they're just not engaging with it at all.
Is there a place where you can point to where you see one or the other being expressed on college campuses?
I'm a freshman, so I can't really necessarily point to colleges, because it's not like I've been here for very long. But I know at least in high school, from my experience was, I remember in 9th grade once, this is around 2016, so I can see why they viewed me with some reasonable suspicion. But I said that America's the #1 country. And of course, all the kids in my ceramics class immediately started questioning me, and I think they're very suspicious. And whenever I kind of argued that viewpoint in other classes, I think I was immediately proposed to be a nationalist. Whereas I was of that liberal nationalism thing, where it's like America is the #1 country in terms of promoting free liberal values and challenging them. However, I was often suspected to be of nationalism, and so I never felt like it was even a discussion, really. It's not like we ever really talked about the difference, which is that you defined in your book, because it was kind of assumed that if you like America, you are that Trump nationalist big group thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a very odd time historically since the all-volunteer military, because that really has changed what is at stake for students in talking about and thinking about and engaging with the United States as a nation, right? When there's a draft, and when it isn't just, people from low-income families who serve in the military, there's a very different kind of engagement with what the objectives of the nation are on college campuses. And I guess I just like reflecting back, like when I was your age, I was in ROTC. And how I thought about what the nation was doing was really different than everybody else, who was just like, it was like school was coming like a holiday. So your experience is an interesting one. I can see where that would have been a complicated and uncomfortable situation.
Okay. Cool, thank you.
Sorry, thanks very much for your question, Navin. Appreciate it. Our next question, and I would note we have just a few more minutes, but we'll try to get 2 more questions in. Our next question is from Katrina from Delaware.
Hi.
Hey.
How you doing?
All right.
My question is about, like, I don't know if you've heard, but like Princeton's decision, like around, so a white student said the N-word, and a faculty or professor called the Black Justice League a terrorist group, and they were not reprimanded based on the university's decision, saying it didn't violate any policies or anything. So I was just wondering what your ideas on, like, well, that in general, your view, and then also just the role of universities and like lack of education versus education on these important kinds of matters, and like what that facilitates for, like, we're being sent out in the world to do all these things. So white students being allowed to say the N-word being a policy of the university and stuff like that, like what influence do you think that will have on the major national play and like this whole conversation on liberalism and nationalism?
What would you like to see Princeton do?
I also think, sorry, Jill, sorry, Professor Lepore, to interrupt. I think we might bring on Chris also, given the institutional nature of the question, but sorry to interrupt you.
Okay. Yeah, Katrina, can I just ask what you would like to on this issue?
I mean, personally, I feel as though it was like grossly mishandled, because I feel as though by saying, oh, you know, white students can say the N-word, and all that he did in general, he just sent out a lot of messages of harassment. And I think it really neglected Black mental health and the effects that hearing that word can have on Black students. And like by saying it wasn't harassment was invalidating. At the time when students emailed, they were sent to counseling services, which acknowledged the harassment without actually giving any punishment, and saying like, oh, education is the way, or like we told them, you know, not to do that, really negates the importance of consequences for one's actions, and how I feel like the Black students are often ignored in that. And then same thing for the being called a terrorist group and all that. And I, of course, believe free speech, but I also believe that free speech doesn't mean freedom from consequence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know anything about what's going on at Princeton. I could barely keep up with what's going on here. You know, but these are obviously issues that are you know, come up across the country repeatedly. We keep having this conversation again and again and again. So I feel like I just don't want to like put my foot in, like I don't really know what's going on there. So I'm gonna punt over to Chris and hear a little more about it. But thank you for raising.
You know, I want to make sure the students have chances to hear from you. So let me describe just roughly the background and see whether you want to comment on it or leave it for discussion at Princeton. As the student questioner said, we had a faculty member this summer who referred to a student activist group as a small local terrorist organization. That was inaccurate, and I registered my strong objection to the statement, but I also said that our policy on free speech and academic freedom protects that speech along with a lot of other speech, and then wrote an essay saying, look, it's very bad when we call one another names, but on the other hand, the search for truth requires us to, at a university, to have a very broad ambit for free speech, including speech that can make people uncomfortable. As you say, Jill, it's a conversation that goes on a lot, and a conversation that we will continue at Princeton, and that obviously I'm very engaged with, and I expect the students will be very engaged with. But the principles, the issues, aside from the specific facts, are about the application of a broad understanding of free speech in the college environment.
I mean, I guess what I would add, I could say something, I guess, Katrina, I could say something as a historian about one of the ways I think about this. I mean, in terms of like what community Princeton is, like, God knows it's the last thing for me to say, like what decisions you all should be making, but obviously I think that students should be very much a part of that conversation. But historically, what's always fascinated me is how, you know, what came to be called the no platform movement on the left came from the right? It really came, really was first expressed in the 1960s in California when Ronald Reagan was running for governor of California. And the University of Berkeley, California students invited Stokely Carmichael to speak on campus. And Reagan and Reagan supporters waged a big campaign to insist that it was wrong to present a university platform for someone to speak the way Carmichael spoke. So much of what we think of as that impetus to deny people a platform, to insist on speech codes, historically comes from the right. Like that's why the free speech movement, that's how, you know, that's among the reasons it got started and was so dynamic at the University of California, Berkeley in the early years of the 1960s. What's fascinating to me as a historian is how that moved from the right to the left. Because now, it's a partisan battleground, right? Even if you use the expression free speech, it no longer refers really to the First Amendment. It refers to a partisan discussion. That is an essential one to have. But again, not like in terms of what Princeton does it follow a model like University of Chicago has embraced a set of what some people would describe as a kind of fundamental free speech fundamentalism. Other universities have very particular speech codes where the talk that you described would have been prohibited and where there'd been kind of predetermined consequences. Universities have struggled with how to address this. That is to say, how to both be mindful of and really hear and think through and have the leadership within the institution come from communities that have heightened concern about certain kinds of language, while also, doing what Chris talking about, thinking about the commitment of a university to be a place for unregulated speech and for freedom of speech. So I think it can be, for many institutions, a really tricky situation. And I'm sorry to hear about this, really bad stuff going down over the summer. It's really painful way, can be a really painful way to start out at an institution. But I hope that your experience there, the experience of everyone there this year, is that this is a place where you feel like you can do your best learning and your best thinking and learn from other people and express yourself and feel safe to do so and emboldened. It should be a place where you feel ready to do your best work and to say what you need to say.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely plan on doing that and challenging this policy.
Thanks.
Katrina, thanks very much for your question. Appreciate it. And indeed, given the time, we will have one more question. And if Aaron from Pittsburgh is still on the line, Aaron, the question is over to you.
Hi, I'm not sure how my name got put as Aaron, but my name's Sam. I'm from Pittsburgh, PA. And I guess I should preface this by saying that I'm interested in studying history. And so one of the things that really stood out to me about your book was this tension you talk about shying away from writing national history and how that opens the door to people like Bill O'Reilly to write these very hortatory, these histories that have an agenda. But you also tell us that these historians have existed for a long time. You point to Lawford Stoddard of a century ago, and that's someone who's largely been discredited today. So my question is, if we are going to continue or start again to write national histories, what lessons can we learn from the sort of halcyon days of writing national history that we could apply today as we try to combat people like Bill O'Reilly?
So I wrote this little book, This America, after I had finished writing a 1,000-page history of the United States. I wrote this very long book called These Truths, A History of the United States, that was my attempt to offer an account of the nation's past that was different from those earlier academic stories, and also really different from the triumphalist narrative. I mean, I think what I take away from the state of affairs is that the stories that we tell about the nation's past have become as polarized as our politics, like is all kind of this weird either or. Like either you have a kind of Bill O'Reilly, like everything the United States and America has ever done in the world and at home has been a brilliant triumph of liberty and freedom and prosperity, or you have a kind of, Howard Zinn version on the other side where, maybe where everything's essentially a kind of a litany of atrocity. And that, like, you the same way you pick your political affiliation, you pick your history. And that's nuts. Like, history is a form of intellectual inquiry that is answerable to evidence and to the discipline of historical investigation and research. So it's not like when you are interested in chemistry, you choose between chemistry or alchemy. It's not like when you're interested in the stars, you choose between astronomy or astrology. Like, okay, like we recognize astronomy as a science and astrology is kind of like a hobby, or, the alchemy is goofy. Like you can't turn things into things. Chemistry is a science. Like history is a thing. Like you actually have to study it, and there has to be evidence, and you make an argument. And yes, it's interpretation, and someone can revise it in the same way. Your chemical finding could be proven to be wrong by subsequent research, or like that's fine. Like the fact that what we know in any discipline changes over time. In any other discipline, we feel like of course it should. So I think that we need to bring, we need to insist on the necessity for that kind of rigorous fealty to the methods of a discipline. Now, we will have a disagreement over interpretation, but I think what's to be resisted from the history is using your history to just kind of line yourself up with a political party and its agenda. That doesn't help our public culture. It's not really defensible as scholarship either.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for your question, Sam. That was our final question. I will note, as your humble moderator, that we took the questions as they came in. So that means, Sydney from Piscataway, Abar's from Turkey, Nick from Atlanta, Ashley from Michigan, and all the others. Apologies, sorry we could not turn to your questions. I do hope that everyone found this was a fascinating conversation, as I did. There will be opportunities to continue this discussion on these important issues in the days and weeks to come, and truly throughout your time as a Princeton student. So with that, over to you, President Eisgruber, for our closing.
Ben, thank you, and my thanks especially to the class of 2024 for joining us for this session and for asking such good questions. You'll all have the opportunity to continue the pre-read conversation over the course of the coming week in small discussion groups, and I'll look forward to speaking with you over the course of the coming term. And Dr. Jill Lepore, thank you again for your participation in this wide-ranging discussion. I'm so glad that you could be with us virtually, and I'll hope that we have a chance to welcome you to Princeton in person in the not too distant future. Class of 2024, I want to close with one more program note. I hope that you'll be able to join the watch party for the virtual Step Sing at 8 p.m. That's Eastern Daylight Time. And good luck with your first day of classes tomorrow when we all begin. I look forward to our interactions and the years ahead. Take care and be well. Thank you for joining. Bye-bye.